What's up? Welcome to a new episode of Movie Schmovie. This is Steve. I'm one of the co-hosts of the show. We are here tonight with episode 378. And we, by that I mean my two co-hosts I'm always joined with. And that is
Ron
and John.
I want to ask if either of you watched The Artifice Girl real quick before I forget.
No,
Okay.
I still didn't watch it.
No, not
I
yet.
didn't know if
not yet.
I didn't know if you speaking like that, John, was a
Oh, it was like a thing.
something about that. I don't know, maybe.
I know.
Okay. Just on my mind before
And
I
I'll be
forget.
on.
Okay.
Now I'll be on the lookout for that in the movie.
So we
All
won't be
being
talking
vocals.
about that on this episode tonight, but maybe soon. We might be trying to get the filmmaker on the podcast if we can make that happen.
Man.
Yes,
But,
That would be really
definitely.
cool.
But what
I'm
we
definitely
will
going
be
to watch it.
talking about was John's pick for required viewing last week, which was Ganja and Hess.
Yes.
And then we've got a little bit of a grab bag of some movies that most of them have either been in theaters and now come to video on demand or kind of started on video on demand. But we've got a slight collection of films. We're going to be talking a little bit about Sisu, which was a theatrical release that's now on demand digitally. Also, there's a new movie out that came out last week called How to Catch a Killer that stars Ben Mendelsohn and oh man, I'm blanking out. Help me, somebody. Divergent. Dated Aaron Rodgers. Somebody.
I'm not.
Nobody's
I don't
helping
speak
me. Wow.
Divergent. And I don't speak Aaron Rodgers. I don't
Do
think.
you speak the movie that I'm talking about? Ronald,
one?
you the How to Catch a Killer. Oh my God, Ben Mendelsohn, and she was in
Shailene
Spectacular Now.
Shailene
Yes.
Woodley.
Shailene?
Thank
Oh,
you.
the lead of
Yeah, I
Divergent.
can't-
I might
for
have
some
guessed that.
That
For some reason-
that took a while. Thank you.
Yeah,
guys.
once you said the name, I was like, I know that. Shailene Woodley.
Okay, Shailene.
Yeah.
So she's in that as well. And then what else you got? Attack of the Doc. What is it
Attack of the
called?
Doc
Attack of the
was the name of the documentary. It's a
Right,
documentary
about Attack of the
about
Show.
Attack
Right.
of the Show
The
in
G4.
the G4 channel, right?
I don't know. Some other things I'm sure we'll mention. Does that sound about right, guys? Am I forgetting anything that we discussed?
I saw. Did you mention How to Blow Up a Pipeline? I mean, you mentioned that a couple weeks ago. As
No,
something
I
you'd
have
seen,
not.
But
No,
I
yeah.
finally saw it, and so I would probably end up just echoing your thoughts to some extent. But I definitely think that I could say a few words.
Okay, cool. We'll run through that towards the end. Ronald, I'm sure you have a couple things too that you want to bring up. But let's start with the required viewing. John, remind everybody of your choice, why you picked it, and I guess you can jump right into talking about it.
Well, this is a movie from 1973, written and directed by Bill Gunn, who I dug into him a little bit, and he seems like a really interesting guy. He's written a lot of plays, and he really only directed 3 movies before his death in 1989. One of them is like a lost movie. The movie he did before our choice today, Ganja and Hess, was called Stop, an ironic name for a movie that was essentially shelved by the studio. But it's supposedly, I mean, it sounds like, a pretty interesting movie in that it was intended as a drama involving 2 couples becoming involved with each other within homosexual and interracial sexual contact alongside surreal undertones. So it actually sounds very much like it would have fit with the style of the movie we're talking about tonight, which
Right.
is very surreal and has like socio-political stuff mixed in with sexual stuff mixed in with just a story as well. That I actually was almost expecting a story I couldn't track as well as I could the story in Ganja and Hess. But I do think that the sort of status as like an artistic director and a person with ideas that he was working out in an experimental way. Bill Gunn seems like a really interesting guy. So I might be digging into some of his other screenplays or the movies he wrote and plays in the weeks to come. But for me, this was just one of those movies that kept coming up specifically on a list of like, seminal films from this era, the 70s, which gave us a lot of great genre, a lot of horror movies that are still being kind of felt and reacted to today. But also the simple fact that it's on top of that, an early horror film written and directed by a Black man was something that, that's another significant thing that made this film keep popping up on my radar. And I realized like I felt like I hadn't really completed my studies, if I was not going to watch this film. So I just was excited to finally check it out. And this feature, to me, I like the way the required viewing can serve a few different purposes. And one of them is just, yes, that movie that you haven't watched for whatever reason, now you're going to put it on the calendar and you're going to have somebody to talk to about it. So
Right.
This movie was kind of all of that for me. But yeah, I had not seen it. I had maybe felt I had seen more of it than I had. Actually, I don't know that I've seen a single frame of this movie before I started watching it for this show. And yeah, I mean, I'd heard that it was kind of dreamlike and a mix of the sort of filmmaking you might expect from 1973, but also there's a European experimental film almost kind of influence in this, and the fact that it does exist as an art film, almost more so than a narrative, but it definitely has as I said, a narrative to it. Yeah, I didn't know what to expect, and I was kind of continually surprised by this movie. What did you guys think, Ronald? I know you had heard of this movie before.
Yeah,
Had
I
you watched it?
mean, no, I don't remember much about it. I do know that it confused me a lot. Like the dreamlike thing, especially when I was younger, it would have been unwatchable to me. Like it would
Right.
have been like, you know what I mean? Like the artsy thing started when I was like 19, 20. So like I could not imagine sitting down and watching this to completion. And it was just like super hard to figure out what the relationships were sometimes. And like there were just parts where it would just drift off. Like he'd be like, yes.
Well, what would happen is then a line of dialogue might come up that explains what you've been wondering for 40 minutes. It's like most films make you wonder things for like 5 minutes. Movies like this make you wonder things for 20 minutes to a half hour or something, because you're wondering, are they ever going to come back to this? Are they ever going to comment on this? How interested in plot is this movie? You don't know when you're watching it. So yeah, Ronald, I agree. Young me would have thought, oh, I'll check this out. This sounds cool. And then have been like, oh, I don't know that I get it, But I was glad I actually read up on it a little bit. So I was able to kind of put together a reasonable facsimile of what happens in this movie and what it all means. But it still leaves a lot of doors open.
Yeah, I think as an adult, I still had a little trouble following and understanding what was happening.
Yeah.
I feel like you mentioned it like quickly, John, but just like the narrative, like a piece of art versus like an actual narrative of a film. I think that's kind of where I kind of fell, and I felt like it was probably, a lot of one, not a lot of the other for me. Like I felt like it was less of a story, less of a narrative than just kind of like an exercise. And I mean, there's some really like interesting cinematography and some, interesting filmmaking happening in the movie. But I mean, I think just like Ronald even said, there was a couple of moments where, I feel like I started questioning whether I was even really understanding what the relationships were between some of the characters or what I was supposed to track. But yeah, I don't know. I found it to be like, yeah, I can probably say like I can appreciate it as like a piece of art, or there's and to be honest, like I actually started watching the film with a commentary track on by accident and was just kind of pulled into it, and I was like, oh wow, this is pretty interesting. And then I turned it off because like I probably shouldn't watch it like that. But then I found that watching it with it, I was really enjoying the movie a lot more. With like, I think it was the director, it was the DP, the person who wrote the score for the film soundtrack.
Sam Wayman.
Yeah, and there was one other person on the commentary track.
Wasn't it Ganja? Wasn't it the lady that played?
It might have.
Ganja?
Yeah, it was Ganja. That's right. Is what?
Because I mistakenly hit it, and I was like, "Oh, this sounds really cool."
I think we watched it in the same spot. And when I watched it by default, it was playing the commentary track.
Okay, yeah,
with it. And I was like, oh wow, this is interesting. And I was like, I'm gonna turn it off and just watch it as I should. And like for 30 minutes into it, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. But then I found it so much more interesting when I was like listening to them talk about
right.
like the filming of it and like the motivation behind some of the scenes. Like there's some sequences like, where there's like 4 different angles of a slow-mo shot played over and over and over and over again from like, a second behind one another. And hearing her speak about that, I found was way more interesting as I was watching it than, I mean, to be honest with you, than just watching it personally.
Well, I mean, I kind of had a similar experience in terms of like, I stopped about halfway in, not like, oh, I can't watch this, but I just had to stop. And then in the meantime, I was like curious about some things, and I read up on like some of the making of the movie and some of the things behind it. And when I came back to watch this, I was glad in a sense that I had done that, because the last half of it, I was like so much more locked into what was happening. And I would say that like the story is actually very linear in a way. Like it's maybe so simple that you would consider it less of a narrative because it's like the structure for these kind of interludes. But the idea is, and I think it's actually a pretty cool way to become a vampire. Like there was one little creepy detail that I thought was cool. This guy's stabbed with this ceremonial dagger,
Yeah.
but he's stabbed 3 times, once for the Son, once for the Father, and once for the Holy Ghost. And somehow like just that, like that's what is like the spell or the curse that turns him
Right.
into this undead being who's not a vampire. The word vampire never comes up. They can walk around in the sunshine, but they do need to drink blood, and they do seem to be set up for immortal life. But instantly you're starting to feel like there's a nightmare quality to this for the characters, that they're not quite in control of it. And then there's this whole sideline of the chauffeur who's a friend of
Yeah.
of the main guy, Hess, is also the preacher who performs his wedding to Ganja, but then later is the person who kind of calls him forth to be saved. And so he sort of rejects the immortality that's been given to him. And I think it's really interesting that the movie ends with, spoilers, folks, with Ganja not rejecting the immortality. And in fact, she seems kind of happy that now she's got this young stud who's sort of returned from the dead, the way that she did and the way that Hess did. Now she's left with
the
this
guy
young
with the ropey penis that jumps over the dead body.
Yeah. Well, the guy, and he's the guy who came to dinner that they killed and left in the field.
That was him?
Still alive. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the idea being like Hess was, but it seemed like he knew he was
totally
still
different.
alive. But I mean, it's the same way that they became undead or vampires or whatever. So it seems like maybe there was some acknowledgement of this. But I do think it's
Okay.
interesting the way the religion, like the movie doesn't draw these easy. We've seen a lot of vampire type stories that have religion in them, but I felt the
100%.
movie was kind of interesting the way that it didn't draw any obvious connections between the two. And in the end, I thought it was interesting how the boldness of this movie, I mean, this movie gets lumped in with blaxploitation, but and I read something that the director Bill Gunn said that was interesting. He said the critics didn't know what to do with this movie because they had never seen a black man in a mansion with a butler before.
Wow.
And a chauffeur.
Wow.
And that was where he felt like he was doing something bold, not that he was necessarily the boldness of blaxploitation are these kind of, negative stereotypes mixed with things we think of as kind of culturally cool. But he was trying to avoid all of those tropes when he made this movie. And, I think I said last time before we watched it, he said the last thing he wanted to do was make a black vampire movie. And it's like, well, that's kind of what you're making. But at the same time, when you see this movie, you can see what he meant by that. I think that he was like not going to make, like, even the way the sexuality, this movie's got so much sexuality in it, but it's not filmed it's filmed like in an artistic way. It's not filmed in a leering way. That idea of the male gaze is kind of missing from a movie that does have some female nudity in it. It does have like one really long sex scene in it, which they beat Twilight to having glittery vampires, because that was like pretty sure that's glitter all over them in that sex scene.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I thought that like those things made it really interesting to me. And that's why I think reading up on it and going, oh, okay, I'm getting a little bit more of the cultural context of this, because critics at the time, I mean, it's crazy. They would say, like, as a way of criticizing it, that it was black oriented.
Yeah, man.
And like, that's all they would say. And it's like, oh my God, that's not a good look. But the idea that this movie had to overcome people's prejudice against just the idea of why you were seeing black people in a movie, it reminds me of people as recently as like, Woody Allen and the Coen brothers and people like that coming under criticism for when they have black people in their movies, it's only cabbies or pimps or sex workers or whatever. And it's like that as early as 1973, you had a guy who was, the whole point of what he was trying to do was to like be revolutionary by just saying, okay, that's not this movie. It's like just by not centering whiteness, you've made a movie that makes white people or some white people very uncomfortable. But then this is a movie that might make you uncomfortable even if it was a straight story that didn't have some of these overtones to it, because it is like, I don't know, there is some genuinely kind of creepy imagery in it, but more so I thought that the sexuality, the vampire addiction analogy was really in the forefront. You didn't really feel like there was any demonic evil in this story. Which again, I think was part of his point too, which was to depict much more of an addiction thing. But anyway, I mean, obviously I have lots of little thoughts because I did so much research about it, but I do think it's an interesting artifact of its time that also feels like it's connected to things, and maybe influenced some people, but it's kind of an underground film still to this day. Like people still talk about it as a movie that you know, maybe a lot of people have seen and were influenced by, but not a lot of people talk about.
Yeah. I'm glad that I watched it. Marlene Clark was like, I fell in love with her. Like I fell in love with this woman on screen. Like she just was super charismatic, and her and Dwayne Jones just had like a lot of electricity on the screen. Like I really enjoyed that. I kind of would have just preferred like a rom-com or something with them, with a rich guy and a cross, you know, kind of angry sort of lady who challenges him in a way.
I like the way she starts off, and she even says at some point that she's interested in money, and she just goes for like experiences and stuff.
Yeah.
And she asks him those inappropriate questions as a way of kind of probing him and all that stuff over their meals. And it's like you see later that she really was sizing him up maybe more the whole time. Like she was a little bit, even though he kind of brought her unwillingly or half willingly into this world of immortal life. I think that or immortality. I think that it's interesting to see that she is, like you said, Ronald, she's this kind of brash character that even at her first scene on the phone, she feels like a different energy. And I liked how much their dialogue felt like just people talking. I think that's one thing, even the earlier dialogue scene with his assistant who ends up killing himself, like who's played by Bill Gunn, by the way, the director played that guy who killed himself. And so like, I think that it's interesting to see the way that there's this tone being set up that's very thoughtful and somber from the beginning. And then she's like, I like when he said, how will I know who you are, when he's picking her up at the airport. And she's like, you can't miss me because I'm that evil.
Yeah.
And then I also like later, she has this great line that I think is almost like the movie's mission statement. She says, everybody is some kind of freak.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think it's cool. It sneaks up on you how much she's more in control, or she's at least able to get around the situation in a way maybe that even he isn't. He seems a bit more tormented by this status, where she seems maybe kind of liberated by it. And she at one point said all 69 positions when she's talking about having sex with him. And that's the first time it occurred to me that, like, I always, 69, I always thought it's based on a positioning and how you look like a 6 and a 9, but it never occurred to me that there were 68 positions before you got to 69.
Great. It's great timing.
Yeah.
They really planned that one out well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking into, like, I was reading, like I said, listening to the commentary was really insightful. And I think looking into some of it after watching the movie, like you mentioned some of it already, John, but the thing I found most interesting was like the idea, this movie it had its premiere at Cannes. And then, it went on and did not have box office success. Like you said, I think on last week's episode, it was kind of like production companies were trying to capitalize on movies that were, a part of that phase of the blaxploitation films. And specifically, they talk about what's it called, Blackula. Like apparently, it's one of the biggest films like of that year prior.
Mm-hmm.
But that this movie didn't find an audience, and it didn't perform and everything. And that they recut the film like at that point,
Right.
and they cut, I think it was either 35 or 45 minutes of the movie.
It goes from an hour, almost an hour, like maybe 152 or 53 to like a 78-minute long movie. So yeah,
right. It's like crazy
chunk.
Yeah, and like at that point, I think Gunn, I was reading like he kind of disowned the film and kind of was not supporting the movie at that point. But in years, in recent years, it's kind of especially found an audience and kind of cemented this kind of cult classic status that it has. But and there are more versions of it available now, like the one I'm talking about that had this commentary track and things like that. Maybe you got it from somewhere, Ronald, but it's just so interesting, like how the movie can go from like the motivations behind the movie from what you can read, to what it doesn't succeed, and then they still try to capitalize on the era by cutting so much of the movie into a different movie that even the filmmaker, the writer, and even those involved with it were like completely disconnected from at that point. And then decades later it's like reassembled, and it's really kind of found an audience and kind of gotten, I guess, more the appreciation, the attention that I don't know, maybe audiences just weren't ready for at that time. I don't know. It's just it's an interesting like timeline. It's one of those stories, and we've watched some movies even on this section of our show in recent weeks where like you hear about the cuts of movies happening and like filmmakers like removing themselves from the film, and it's just so wild that like as time goes on, that some of these films in their original version find an audience, and in some cases the version that does get chopped up or cut or whatever, like the one that you picked that we watched with Mathau, that would
A
be
New
the
Leaf.
opposite side, where people were like, oh, the cut version actually is the better film.
Right.
It just kind of goes two different directions sometimes, but I don't know, that really stood out to me, that's a pretty drastic cut.
Well, by all accounts, the shorter version is a schlockier movie,
Right, right.
And I there was one interesting thing that I read that said that I think the financiers were I don't know if they were European or something, but basically they had other projects on their plate, and so he had an unusual amount of freedom when he was making the movie, to like change the script. Like they really bought into the script that he wrote, and then he was able to make a different movie in a sense based on just what was happening and the way he wanted to go that day, when he was shooting, because he didn't have this oversight of these producers. Right. So I think that's a factor. One other thing I did want to mention before we left it, there's just brushing your teeth with the bathwater of the tub you're in is one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen.
Oh my God.
It was gross.
But I wanted to just mention the religious aspect of this. There are some images of like a tribal figure with like a headdress going through a field that I believe are supposed to be this, and I've the Murthian tribe, I think is what they call them. Like I've been looking into this. I can't tell if this is a piece of folklore or a tribe that they used as fodder for the movie or something he completely invented. But I just wanted to state, I really think it's cool how this movie resets your idea of like the source of the magic, even though that it's got the Trinity mentioned in this, stabbing once for the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. Yeah. But I love that the source of the magic is not the Christian. I mean, it's not the usual iconography, even though there's tons of Christian iconography in this film. I like that it suggests this other origin of the magic, the force, whatever, and that at one point, like it's just, I mean, I guess I've heard this before, but maybe never put this bluntly. But the cross being referred to as an implement of torture, is just, I mean, it is.
It is.
That's why they would kill someone on a cross, is because it's a torturous way to die. But like just hearing it mentioned that way is such an outside like the Judeo-Christian culture that we're used to. The way we talk about the cross is always, or at least as a Christian, but in modern culture, the way the cross is referred to is always as this symbol through, Jesus or whatever. But to like reset your thinking of it and say that like if you weren't like holding yourself to Christian ideals and you're just looking at it from the outside, it's an implement of torture that is like you stand in the shadow of it when you're in a church, and that is sort of an interesting, I don't know, maybe not totally outside view of Christianity, but I thought it was really cool how the movie gave you all that. And then like at the end, when Hess has been redeemed, or seemingly, he's in the shadow of the cross, but it's a redemptive moment for him. And it's a moment that she doesn't have to go in. She doesn't have to do that. Like, there's not like someone throwing holy water on her, making her make the quote unquote right choice. The movie doesn't present it as like a right choice. It almost presents it as like he's too weak to handle immortality. And so he goes for redemption. I don't know. I just wanted to say, I think those religious themes are something that might make the movie interesting, on top of some, I will say, I really thought the dialogue scenes were really engaging. Like there were some moments, it's very unpolished acting in this, but there was something that felt very, I don't know. I always leaned in when two characters were talking. It felt like, in the middle of all this artistic filmmaking and religious imagery, it was like really weirdly grounded in a like you said, Ronald, you could almost do the straight movie about this relationship and it would work. So yeah, I'm very glad I saw it.
Me too.
So I have a suggestion, since and this is already on the middle of the show, so we can edit around this if we have to. But since we are now at the end of one of the cycles of required viewing, and there's something we've been wanting to do. We've been wanting to do a bracket episode, and if you're listening to the show, you don't know what that is yet, but we'll figure out exactly what that means. But I was thinking maybe we'll take, for the next episode, a break from required viewing so we can devote it to this bracket idea. And then tier list. But also, that allows us, you can go ahead and say what your choice is. I think, Ronald, you're the first one in the rotation, so you can say what your next required viewing choice is. But it'll be a few weeks before we get to it, because next week maybe we'll do a tier list episode, and then the week after that, I think we're having a little break. We'll be silent for 1 week, and then we'll be back the week after that. So maybe it'll be like 2 weeks hence that we'll be back, or 3 weeks hence that we'll be back.
So I
with
could
a new cycle of required viewing.
I can say what the movie is.
Yeah, you get to say it, but people have a long time to watch it. So if you give us a long movie, that
I was trying to think. I was trying to think of something that I wanted to see that maybe I heard one of you guys mention or something that I didn't get a chance to see. Vesper.
Oh yeah.
Did both of you see it?
No,
I haven't seen it, but I've mentioned it before.
Okay, I've heard so many things about this movie. Never saw it.
All right, let's do Vesper.
And I hear about it a ton. So what is it on?
That's how a British guy says Vespa.
Yeah, gotta get my Vesper.
Yeah.
So yeah, it looks like it's on demand. Like
yeah,
it's a couple bucks on Amazon Prime. Yeah, AMC Plus, but I don't know if that's included with that. But it might be on there. So hold on. So the calendar. So next week we have an episode, and the week after that is where we're skipping. So this won't be until the 16th of June.
Yes.
Okay.
Dang.
That'll be our next.
It gives you plenty of time to see this
episode.
movie.
Yes.
So you can technically save $1 a week.
Yeah, save up the $3
and then watch it like a day before.
The week of.
The week of, and you'll have some money to get it, to rent it. Yeah, I'm excited about this.
For the price of a cup of coffee, you can join this required viewing experience with us.
I'm throwing the newest genre to come into the whole.
The infant, the babe.
Yeah, the infant of genre sci-fi, which you guys just recently introduced me to.
That's interesting. Well, I have my little short list of required viewing ideas, and one of those is one of those for me, where it's like a very recent movie that I just felt like, oh, I didn't watch it, and now I can, and I can make you guys talk to me about it. So
I've heard good things. I'm like, man, let's knock this one out.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. No, I love Eddie Marsan, and he's in that. I think that's where
it came. Small man? Is that the smaller man with the kind of crazy face?
A little, yeah. He was in Ray Donovan.
Yes. Yeah,
he's one of the brothers.
Oh,
yeah, I don't know. It was on like a list of his, like, that's how it first crossed my radar. It was like it was on some recent thing, like movies you haven't seen, and they were mentioning how, if you're a fan of his, that he's in it. I don't know if he plays the father or something.
Okay,
of Vesper.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I love him too.
Yeah, cool. I'm haol to watch that. I've actually have it on my IMDb watch list, so I'll be able to check one of them off.
Cool.
All right, so I guess if we're gonna do a tier list next week, should we talk about what the tier list is, or?
Well, I had a thought.
We haven't.
No, I had a thought because I don't know. I still don't know if this would work for one, but I think this could work for one. Since Barry and Succession are both ending this weekend, you could do HBO shows.
Okay. Like period,
a tier list of HBO shows.
That's a crazy one.
Because I was like, is there enough there? And then I thought, and I was like, oh yeah, man. There's enough there.
Hell yeah.
There's almost too much.
It's too much there. I guess we'd have to either have the list, and we're just kind of. So normally, like, the tier list that I'm thinking about is, you have basically an S tier and then A through, D or A through F, whatever. But like basically, the title comes up and we move it in, and this would be good for the YouTube portion of the podcast. We would actually can move the graphic into, whatever we vote the show to be, and we would pick them. We would pick them individually. We would rank them individually, and then there'd be an average for like the Schmovie placement.
We're going as far back as our list. Like,
well, that's what I'm saying. Like, if it's something as large as like the HBO series, you would either have to define like a period. You'd have to have, you'd say we're going to have these 10 shows or whatever, and we would rank them. Mm-hmm. Or it'd be more something like, something more. Another option would be something like doing a tier list of the Mission Impossible films, or of the DCU or the MCU, or, you know what I'm saying? Or like the Halloween franchise. Like, it's just where it's a finite amount of entries that we could.
Could you do like post Sopranos? I mean, would that help? I know that doesn't help too much.
That would narrow it down.
Though. I mean, definitely narrows it down.
Because that's like the era of prestige television. That's like
Yeah.
the era of HBO being like this crazy.
Because there
brand.
was still a ton of shows before it spread.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not opposed to that idea. I think we just got to know for sure what they are, and that there's not too many that it's going to be a 3-hour podcast.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we could also like find some way. What I was thinking was, is there a way to like eliminate a lot of things early, like somehow end up with a top 12 or like pull an American Idol,
Mhm.
start with like, start with like 50 finalists and then end up with 12 in like one step. You know what I mean? Like that there's got to be some way to do
What
that.
about the last 10 years? What if we do 2013 to 2023? And then maybe we could go before that for the next one. I mean, but
to me that knocks out too much of the interesting mix of like your Deadwoods and your Game of Thrones and your Succession. You know what I mean? Like to me, it knocks out too much stuff. But I do think there's got to be some way to get the list that we're ranking down.
There's so many
way to do
HBO
it quickly.
shows. It's
Well, we'll figure it out. Anyway, that was just a thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can just run the pod and just have the idea, and that's the idea. You know, we don't have to announce it necessarily, but we'll iron out those details and hopefully have a nice tier list next week as a special one-off kind of experiment. Because I do think it would be something cool to do, and especially the idea initially when I mentioned it was just the idea of like when we get into these properties that come along that have, it's a franchise, or we could group it along with something. And especially in cases like where we're not able to see the movie beforehand, things like that, just to be a little more timely and talking about stuff in the genre or stuff in the franchise, the tier list, even if it was like in a shorter version of it in the same episode, would be cool to just kind of have as a new, like a new segment on the show, where listeners can get an idea of where we and the show, fall on that franchise or on that, whatever group of things. Like if we do the HBO thing, like just like kind of where we fall on that period of HBO or that selection of HBO's titles.
What if we all agree on like a list of 12? We'll find some way to agree on like the shows that are in contention for best show ever that are HBO shows. You know what I mean? Like, because there are those shows. There is like, we could figure out
the only risk of that, if we're going with the best shows, is that we're probably not going to have many placed C, D, and F tier. Maybe not. Maybe we could be oceans apart on where we feel about those best shows.
I feel like I could create an F tier even if I'm saying I like all these things. There's still an F tier. Do you know what I mean? Like there's still a lowest tier.
There's a world in where one of the top 12 shows that we would pick would be in an F.
Because in terms of tier, like it still is the worst of the best. You know what I mean? It's
the
still
worst
the
of
bottom
the 12.
The bottom
worst
of the top.
12. Okay.
As Tom said to Greg on Succession.
Got it. Yeah, no, this is cool. Like we'll iron it out. We'll figure out what to do, but that'll be something coming up on the podcast. Like, and I think we'll kind of it'll be something we kind of learn as we go. But I think it'll be kind of fun beyond just talking about a franchise in general, which we've done many times. Or watching along to certain things. I think it'd be fun to actually like each of us say, this is a S, this is a B, this is a D. Be like, okay, well, for the show, that's a B. That sits in the B tier. And like, you don't have to have something in every letter, but ideally, in a lot of cases, like you want to kind of limit what you have as the S tier. Like you have like 1 or 2, like you kind of have like the unanimous thing as like the king of the castle in there. Or the queen of the castle. All right, cool. Well, we'll figure that out for next week. But for this episode, as we move along, I think we've all. Did you watch Sisu, Ronald?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I was making sure I didn't.
Shit,
I didn't see it on the thread, but I mentioned Sisu a few weeks back when I was fortunate enough to see it in its theatrical run. Actually, the weekend that it came out. And I was really happy that it finally, I say finally, just 2 weeks later, it comes out on video on demand. And it's like, it's just like, yeah, you guys can finally check it out. I already said a lot about what I thought about this movie in general. I thought it was awesome. I really liked it. I told you both so much as, the action and just the way it was shot and just kind of like how kind of lean and I don't want to say mean, but just like, it has this aggressive nature to it that I kind of liked, especially in the story that the movie was telling. But I don't know. What did you guys think of Sisu? Ronald, why don't you start, man, since you brought it up most recently?
you know, I knew that it was one of those kind of sneaky movies that for the informed, just people were raving about it. So all I had in my head was that it was a revenge story of some sort, and I was ready. There were some Nazis, but what I got was something that felt a lot more like emotional, a lot more like Sisu, the character, just had a lot behind those eyes. And then some of the things he did for some of the characters really showed that there's something a little more going on with them. Like regardless of what it, it wasn't said beyond, what he did prior to being where he was, when you find him in the story. But that was one of the coolest things in the world. And I I don't know how you could say this without sounding like crazy, but I like the Nazis in it. They were just so like evil in a way that I was like, man, these guys gotta go. It didn't stop, and the I'd never seen something that kind of took on this narrative where basically like the Nazis had gotten chased out, and this was the last hurrah. This was the most evil that they could be before they got kicked out of the country. It was like really cool. The sound of this movie blew my fucking mind. Like I wasn't mentally prepared for how I was gonna. I mean, and the fact that this is like, this is like a PVOD version of the sound, which typically is like not. There's this term that they use, Mickey Mouse mix, online, which is basically like all the Disney Plus stuff is kind of crappy, and it's for big movies with explosions and stuff, and you don't hear what you're seeing on the screen. You'll typically watch something, you're like, this doesn't sound like the thing that's happening on the screen. With Sisu, every little crunch on the ground, you hear everything, and I don't know how they did it, that it sounded so like full for something, so small, that they had this sound design. But this was, between the story and the sound, one of the better movies that I've seen in the past like couple years. I loved it. And it's one of those movies I feel like I could turn on at any point. I could rewatch this movie because the Nazi stuff doesn't get too heavy, but you know how evil they are, and it's just straight violence, and that's what I want sometimes. So I loved it. I thought it was so good. What'd you think, John?
I mean, I guess I'm sort of in the same boat that you both are. I thought it was, I feel like this is a very enjoyable movie, and especially knowing that people have enjoyed John Wick and they've enjoyed even Nobody. I'm trying to think of other movies that kind of hit this model of like just watching somebody go in and
Atomic Blonde.
Atomic Blonde. Yeah. Oh, I knew there was one that I wasn't thinking of. But like that idea of like, we're going to present somebody who's just capable, and they're just going to, like, you're not really worried about them. At the same time, you have to put them up against things that, like, so the injuries have to be gross, and the extremes to which they're punished have to be really strong extremes, but the feeling of like the fun parts of this movie where the comedy is really working, because it's very funny. I mean, it's got a lot of action comedy elements to it. Like those moments where it's a new set piece of like, how is he going to decimate these Nazis? There's a scene in a minefield that is like that, where it's just send one more in, send another guy in, send another guy in. And then there's one in the water where he's, I mean, okay, skip ahead 10 seconds, folks, just because I want to say this. He's slitting Nazis' throats and then then getting air from their bodies as they bleed out into the water. And so we see like it happens to like 2 or 3 guys in a succession, and we're watching him do that, and we're watching the guys on the shore, like, and the main guy keeps sending in another guy, like just pointing. I don't know. There was some really good, like, the fact that he doesn't speak for most of the movie, and then like other characters have a little bits of dialogue in certain scenes, but most of the scenes, it reminded me of a movie like the movie I was trying to think of a second ago, The Raid, where it's just like you get into a situation and the situation has its own momentum to it, and you're just there. And so that's the story, is well, he's got to get from here to here, or he's got to fight through all these guys to get to that, or you add the little element of revenge in this. You know, the one thing that I was really worried about him having to get revenge for is not the thing. I was very glad. There's one thing that doesn't happen in this
Yes.
movie.
Yeah.
And it made me very happy because there's a very cute little fellow running around in this movie that I was so glad didn't get killed. But in general, I think that the fun of this movie is what you take from it. I mean, it almost feels like, what if Sam Raimi made a World War II movie like this or something? It had that element of like visual inventiveness mixed in with, and you say the Nazis, like, they keep them kind of, you don't get into like the Holocaust stuff, but you do have like a truck full of women that they're obviously sexually abusing. That's horrific. And I do feel like the movie kind of throws that in, and it's one of those, like, it's almost it almost breaks the tone a little bit because it's so unsettling, but luckily they don't lean on that too much.
Yeah.
What this really reminded me of was a Mad Max movie. It because
felt
of
like a Mad Max
the
movie.
simplicity of the setup and the just, here's a guy who's got no real life outside of fighting to live.
Yeah.
And it's just, I looked to see if I know this actor from other things, and I really don't think I do, but he was really strong. And there's one scene where you see him, like, in fact, there's a Nazi that he's injured who's watching him, like, cauterize his wounds and create a staple to staple up a slit in his side, and his flesh is just so torn and he's so gnarled and scarred, and it's just so gruesome. But there is a weird kind of, like, lightness is the wrong word, but you've said it, Ronald. There's a kind of fun aspect to this movie that I think people are going to have a good time with. I do think there's a couple of moments that play as a little goofy compared to the tone of the movie, and it's like where the movie pushes those things, but those moments are very, very short, and they don't lean. It's the movie, they don't stick around too long when the movie kind of over stretches its tone for me. But no, I thought it was like what you said, Ronald, too, that it seems like the kind of movie you could just watch again and just have on again. I mean, like the first John Wick, it's kind of lean and mean. What is it, 90 minutes?
Yeah, it's like right at 90 minutes.
So
I love the head Nazi Axel Henny, who was in that movie The Trip that we watched.
Okay.
I think that was last year. Him reacting to every cruel act that Sisu did was so funny. That gag that they did with the bodies was killing me, where it was like the guys in the front that were kind of looking at everything, and
where it's like the guys in the back who don't know what's happening up front, and every time they pass by one of these bodies on the road, he says, "Is that one of ours?" And then the next one is like, "Is that in the name?" No, that I'm on it. Yeah, that was great.
God, that was so good, man. It's just that sort of, and it works. Like a lot of that stuff works. But you're right, tonally, there's obviously some things that get a little like, what's that director? The Jew Hunter on Eli Rothy.
Eli Roth.
Yeah, felt very Eli Rothy at times, but it is one hell of a ride, and I'm glad you said something about it, Steve, and I'm glad you got to see it in the theater. I bet it was insane watching in the theater.
It was awesome, yeah, and it was like, I saw him in the Dolby House too. So, like you mentioned, the sound definitely stands out in those theaters, especially.
You know, the scene where I really noticed the sound was when he's coming at the tanks and he's got the shields and the bullets are going off. But
Yeah.
also you're hearing like the ricocheting bullets off the shield, and you're also hearing. It almost reminds me of like. A student in my class wrote a paper about the sound of Saving Private Ryan, and I've been kind of digging into that. But just that all those little different sounds of bullets hitting the grounds and different kinds of bullets hitting, and it was just I mean, it was just like such a cool moment. But that's the scene where I really noticed, like, this sound is doing something very atmospheric. And then the score occasionally would be like rock music, but it didn't seem anachronistic most of the movie. It didn't feel like it was trying to overdo that idea.
Whoever mixed this thing, man, like it's set up for all sorts of setups, and I think that's what I'm talking about when I talk about like a movie with good sound. I'm not talking about necessarily having a home theater setup, like something that's good enough to sound good on a sound bar or even a TV. Like
it's good that like Steve's got the sound bar, right, Steve?
Yeah.
Ronald, you've got like
Yeah.
a full theater setup in your home.
Yep.
And I
Yeah.
have a crappy LG television with speakers on it that are fine for me.
Yeah,
So it's
but
like 3 levels. We all thought this movie sounded good.
Yeah.
Or actually, you saw it in the theater though, Steve. But did
I
you
did.
rewatch it by any
I
chance?
did. Yeah, I did
Oh,
watch it last week.
okay.
yeah,
I really
man.
like this one. It's definitely a standout so far for me. I mean, it's also like I mentioned it before. I feel like the filmmaker is also a kind of a standout because I feel like this is a movie that was made for like $6 million,
Wow.
and that's kind of crazy when you consider like a lot of the action and the way they shot some of that
Yeah,
stuff. Um, this looks really good. Like I
it
feel like
does.
the effects and the action and the deaths, like like the mine, like you mentioned the mine stuff, like that shit looked amazing.
It did.
And yeah, I don't know. I'm curious what this guy does next because I don't know. It feels like one of those things where a movie like that's gotten attention. It's
Well, he
made
did
back
Rare
at some.
Exports as well, and
Yeah,
that's
I
a movie that
remember
got
that
some
one.
attention. Yeah.
Yeah,
So he,
yeah.
this is, and I
And
would
that
say,
was
yeah, the
also a
look.
while ago, though.
But you're right, Steve. The look and feel of this movie, the stylization of the violence. There's really the first real kill we get, where the guys. I mean, that scene is so great. Where you just know these guys are not gonna. You don't know how bad it's gonna get before he starts fighting back. But when he starts fighting back in the first scene, I loved how he decimates that group that's got him at gunpoint. But the
Yeah.
knife through the head, the
Knife
first
through the
real
head.
kill, it's just. I mean, I hate to say it's like beautiful, but it's like so cool
Yeah.
the way it's shot, and it's such a like. I mean, you can kind of see the seams of the effects occasionally, and it's a little mix of CGI with practical, I guess. But I thought it was just really clever, and it's got that. It's not quite all the way to like Zack Snyder levels of stylized violence, but it does have that. It like good use of slow-mo, good use of when they move the camera around and do something interesting. It really does keep you guessing. And there's a couple of shots that I just noticed were beautiful. Like there's
Yeah.
one shot where he's in the foreground scrounging around to get his gold off the ground,
Oh, with the tank in the
and
background.
like the mist, like through the smoke or the fog, the
Yeah.
tank shows up, and there's like guys, they're all hanging out on top of the tank, and they all look kind of cool. I mean, it's like one of those moments where you go, everything about this shot was like styled to the absolute nth degree, and yet it works within the world of the movie. And that kind of
Yeah.
stuff is just, that's where you want to rewatch a movie, Ronald, is when it's like somehow this movie being a gritty, fun, kind of
Right.
silly action movie, it's got like cinematic grandeur to it, and
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
not something you can't always get that.
$6 million accomplishment. That thing looked like 30, 40 million. Like
Easily,
it
right?
looked.
I mean, looked great.
Golly.
Yeah.
They're gonna pluck him for something bigger.
Yeah, and you're
Like,
talking
this is
about like, yeah, you're
incredible.
talking like you have the mine sequence, you have the water sequence that John mentioned. You have the on the road tank bike thing
Yeah.
that's going on,
The
the
plane scene?
airplane,
The
Oh
hanging
my
I mean,
God.
scene.
all that stuff. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the hanging scene. Like, yeah, there's a lot of setups in this, and it's just really impressive. I thought.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
Also,
we
Steve, I
all
love a movie that has a title that when someone would say it, but they don't say it.
Yeah.
Like there's the beginning of the movie, we get the explanation of Sisu. It's a state of determination that comes when
Yeah.
all hope is lost. And then later in the movie, the girl is kind of doing the I've heard in screenwriting terms, this is called the praise of the killer, where it's like you have somebody talk up the how badass the guy is. There's a few
Yeah.
conversations, but there's a scene where she's talking about like, well, in Finland we have a word that's untranslatable for this thing, this quality that he has, and so we know the whole time it's Sisu, but she doesn't
Yeah.
say it. I like when a movie like makes you think they're about to do they say the name in the movie thing and then they don't do it, but your mind is filling it in for
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
So I thought that was really cool.
Felt Tarantino-y. That part felt very like, oh,
The
man,
chapter
this-
breaks kind of felt like they were
Yeah,
reaching for
sure,
Tarantino
For
too.
sure. For sure. Loved it, man.
Good.
Thank you so much.
It's on demand at home. So if anybody's listening, it sounds interesting. If you haven't caught it yet, it's definitely one to watch. And it's on demand, so you can watch it at your house.
And it knows when to end too. Like I love the little ending moment.
90, yeah, like you said, like 90 minutes. Like just, it's such a good watch. What's next? Who wants to mention anything. I guess moving into just like a bunch of other things that we
How to Catch a
watched.
Killer or whatever, or To
Yeah,
Catch a
yeah.
Killer.
Did either of you watch that?
No, I did
Not
not,
yet.
but I'm very
I'm
curious.
gonna watch it though.
It's okay. I mean, like it's kind of one of those things where I feel like the material just kind of lets down this pretty good cast that's in this movie. Specifically, like I love Ben Mendelsohn. He's one of my
Yeah,
favorites,
he's
and
awesome.
really, he's the reason I wanted to watch the movie. And it's funny because Ronald, you sent the trailer for this like a while back,
Yeah, a while back.
and like none of us knew it existed. It takes place in Baltimore, even though there's no way in hell it was shot in Baltimore. At least the principal photography wasn't.
Right.
I think it's probably shot in Canada or something, but yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting idea. It's very kind of unsettling, just like this any kind of scenario where they're tracking down a serial killer, especially like one. The movie starts off with a pretty jarring sequence in terms of mass casualties involving a sniper, which this area has known in recent history, which was a very scary time for the whole DC Baltimore area. But
the DC extended universe is what we call that.
yeah, exactly, of course. But I don't know. It's just one of these things where, like, you have a great actor, Ben Mendelsohn, and a very good actress, Shailene Woodley, who I don't know that she's really kind of found a place since, she had that run a little bit ago and she was on Big Little Lies. And I don't know, not much since then. But
what was the first movie I saw her in with Miles Teller? I can't believe I
Spectacular Now.
Spectacular Now.
Yeah.
I really liked that movie.
Great movie.
Oh, it's great. I love that movie. But yeah, I love these kind of like catch a killer movies, and literally it's called How to Catch a Killer. So it was like, I'm in. But it's a really kind of
you like catching killers. You don't want them out there.
Yeah, I was like, gotta get them off the streets.
Gotta catch them.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, what a novel idea. Just a very bad script. I mean, it's kind of
really?
So cliche and just kind of like clumsy and a bunch of plot holes and things like that. And the other guy that's in it, the dude who was the voice of the Green Knight. That's how I refer to him as.
Guy with the crazy voice.
Oh yeah,
Innes, Ralph Innes or something like that.
Yeah.
From The Witch, right?
He was in Game of Thrones too. He was
in Game of Thrones. He was also in something else recently.
It's a crazy voice.
He was the voice of. Oh my God! What did I just watched something else with him recently? The Pope's Exorcist. He was the voice
of on my list of things.
He was the voice of the demon in that. Yeah,
perfect.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. Yeah, no, he's really good in it. But it's just a movie. It's just, I mean, you can see why this movie was going straight to demand. Like it's one of those very middle of the road. I mean, this movie's on Netflix. It's in the top 10. I'm telling you right now.
Yeah,
like it's one of these things that just it's got enough going that it's watchable. And it's not like bad. It's not like horrible.
Yeah.
Because it is kind of elevated by, some really great actors and actresses. But personally, I was like, I want to see Baltimore. And it's like there's some aerial shots of the harbor and things like that, but it's like nothing else looks like Baltimore or acts, sounds, whatever. No real distinction.
So is Ben Mendelsohn doing a Baltimore accent or is he doing a British accent?
No. He's just doing his American accent.
Oof.
And even like the Ralph Innes guy, the Green Knight, the voice, even him, like he's American in the show or in the movie, but it bleeds so bad. Like his British accent comes through so heavily.
Dang.
In it, it's just one of those. Yeah, those accents are weird, but this is on demand, so like it's a wait for it for me, I guess, on our scale. But I mean, you've already waited because it never had a shot, so if it's there. You might want to check it out if you like the kind of procedural police like putting together the clues and that kind of thing. But it for someone like Ben Mendelsohn to be in this movie, who I love, and like I feel like he's one of the best actors out there right now,
right?
And I've loved him since one of my previous required viewing picks, Animal Kingdom. But like I will watch anything he does. I don't care to the extent that he's involved with it. But he's one of the leads in this, so I was a little let down that the kind of the dialogue and the screenplay and even some of the filmmaking just kind of lets both him and Shailene down. But it's on demand. It's okay. It's probably like it's a 2.5 out of 4-star movie for me. It's something in that ballpark. But
okay.
That's How to Catch a Killer. What else?
Well, How to Catch a Killer to How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I'll just come and say a few
Oh yeah,
words about
yeah.
that since I finally saw this. You recommended it basically to us a couple of weeks back because you had a good time with it. And I would, yeah, I would second your point of view on this. This was a really like, I mean, I looked to see how it was being described, and it's described as an environmentalist action thriller. And that's what it is. And it's like those two things seem like they wouldn't
Through
go
and through.
together.
Yeah.
Like you
Yeah.
almost associate an environmentalist film or a film with that theme as having like a homework kind of feel to it. Um, and I'm not saying this movie doesn't make you grapple with some interesting, deep ideas, but the way this movie proceeds, like right from the opening moments, it's throwing you into the middle of this plan this group has. I mean, essentially, some people would call them activists, some people would call them terrorists. Um, uh, and you find out as they go kind of what their plan is, what their specific plan is, but it's a little bit of a procedural of, I mean, the title, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, is kind of it's not quite how to. There's actually a point where someone in the film is in like an underground bookstore and they're reading a book, and I don't know if we know what the name of the book is, but the person walks up to him and says,
Yeah.
the book doesn't actually tell you how to do it. And you kind of are thinking, oh, they're reading some kind of environmentalist book or some kind of activism book
Anarchist cookbook.
that might
That's
be
what I was
called,
thinking.
but I mean, the
Right.
book might as well be called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and they're
Right.
reading a book and I think it's based on a book. The movie is, so it made me think, oh, is that like a little meta comment on the book that's got that name isn't actually a how to? But anyway, my point is just the way the characters come together. It feels very of the moment, I mean, it's just like this group of characters, they're young, and the actors are sort of relatively unknown. I recognize the guy who played Ethan. I think I've seen him in something before. Oh no, the guy who played Logan. I'm looking now. Oh, he was an American Vandal, The White Lotus. Oh, okay, so no wonder I recognize him. But
Oh,
anyway,
Lucas Gage.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I may actually recognize.
He's the one that went viral during the pandemic when like that director like was a dick to him in the video audition. Do you remember that video?
No.
He was like auditioning for a part. I don't know if it ever came out what movie or show it was for, but like he was on a Zoom audition, and the director was thought he was muted, and he was like
Oh yeah, yeah.
talking like crazy shit about him or
No.
about how like poor his apartment looked and all this stuff.
Oh.
Oh, it was brutal. But yeah, since then though, he's like kind of sort of come into it because yeah, he was on White Lotus and he's got this. He's got a couple things going right now. But yeah, that's that I recognized him from that whole viral thing during the earlier days of the pandemic.
Well, my
Wow.
point just being that this is a cast of characters that feel like it feels very legit when you don't necessarily associate the actors with a bunch of specific roles.
Right.
And so it added to the sense that I was kind of eavesdropping, as well as watching a reasonably exciting movie that you kind of blandly stand with the point of what they're doing, even if you don't get into the specifics of it. The movie's kind of scant on that stuff, except it's more about the propulsiveness of the moment, and trying to do each little step of their scheme, and how they kind of survive or don't, or who makes it out and who gets caught and all that kind of stuff. And there, yeah,
Right.
it's so it's a little bit of like a crime story and a movie with a message, and just the fact that it is a small movie that tries to create some of those big moments. In fact, I didn't look to see how small this movie actually is, but the budget is not listed. But anyway, very lean and interesting and well done. And if it sounds a little dry, this is not that movie. This is not that movie that makes you feel like you're watching somebody who turned an editorial into a film. It actually does feel like it's trying to hit the needs of being a movie first, and then it actually happens to kind of link up to ideas of sort of, I guess, the question of like, how far would you go for your beliefs, or how far would you go to make a stand, to the point of doing something criminal, as these characters
Right.
do.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. I wanted to talk about something I think that Steve's also going to talk about. And it is in the eve of Max and its rollout, there was a cool limited docu series that came out, and that's the Smartless show. I've only watched the first one, but I'm in. I mean, I'm in. So maybe I should talk about Max also too. So I'm a Discovery Plus owner. I mean, I have it. Aaron loves her 90 Day Fiance and whatnot, and Discovery and HBO Max have fused. They have run into each other full speed to create Max, which is a jumble clusterfuck. And for the first 10 hours or so, most people aren't able to sign in. But once you get in, it's a lot of the same in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of upgrades. A lot of things like Lovecraft Country has gotten a 4K update. Mayor of Easttown 4K update. It's crazy. They're incentivizing kind of stepping up to this new service. Things are in better quality. I saw Sex and the City got a little bit of a bump as well. But Smartless is just a great podcast for anybody that maybe started listening to it during lockdown. It was kind of this thing that felt like a little bit of a hobby and a way to get away from the craziness of the pandemic for the three people involved. Kind of became this huge thing, and they started touring.
Did you say who they are? Jason Bateman, Sean Hayes, and deep voice guy Will Arnett. And they're an unlikely group. I mean, Sean obviously being the more artsy of them, and they all create this cool dynamic that's just nothing more amazing than hearing Will and Jason argue, though. They just rip each other apart. But the DC leg of the tour is the first episode, and it's just really fun to see them interact, and even take in for them this new version of fame that kind of comes. Podcasts resonate with people in a very different way because you're in their ears. You're driving with them, so it feels a little different. So it's crazy. They're responsible for some of the best TV content to ever come on. And yet this podcast is putting them in place where they never thought they'd ever be. So it's fun. It's a really fun experience. Well, they also have, just in terms of the podcast, I'm not sure what the show's doing with this, but they're one of those things. It's kind of like the Conan O'Brien effect of oh yeah, he can get anybody. Oh no shit, he's Conan O'Brien. They have that element. I mean, they on the show, they kind of surprise each other with with a guest. Yeah. But that idea of, okay, yeah, between the three of those guys, they can probably get just about anybody in entertainment, and even from other areas, to come and be on. So it's that's the other aspect of it, is if you're a podcast listener, the big names kind of only go to other big names. Now that everybody with a big name has a podcast,
100%,
there's plenty of places 100%. For big names to go. So they never have to, slum it with the hoi polloi. They can stay with other rich and famous people. Yeah. So I think there's this interesting thing of, it's I shake my fist at those podcasts, those really well done podcasts by famous people who get in at the deep end of the pool because they're famous already. Yeah.
100%.
But it does make for a really cool experience because you can hear some of those people that just in a comfortable conversation that you might not normally get to hear. So.
Yeah. 100%.
Do they have guests on the show? I haven't looked into the show.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's the tour starts off with Will Ferrell. So it just
awesome.
I think what kind of standard does that set for the other cities that they go to?
Yeah. No, it's an awesome podcast. Yeah, I mean they get a little bit into. I've watched the whole series. It just binged it.
Cool.
Really quickly. I love the podcast. I've really been listening to it since they pretty much launched it, and it's really interesting. They touch a bit of it on the series in terms of and they've talked about it on the podcast, but just kind of where the podcast started initially, being something that Will was going to start a podcast during the pandemic to kind of talk about his sobriety and the kind of journey he's been on, like, what he's gone through, and just, for people to relate to, and just to kind of open up a bit. And he talked to Jason about it, and Jason talked to Sean, and it evolved into what it is. But the great thing, if you're a fan of their podcast, is that this element of the series really focuses on just the three of them, and less focus on like who these special guests were for this tour. The special guests for the tour are kind of more like just like the icing on the cake, or like a little side treat or something. The series that Max launched, is, I think it's 6 episodes, is really, just kind of traveling around on these dates or these cities that they did for this tour last year, or was it 22? I guess it was 2022. But really kind of just like having time with them off camera, even though they're being filmed, obviously. But I mean, like, off recording the podcast, and like to kind of see how they are amongst one another, to see how it's not all, like laughs and fun. Like, there's definitely some dramatic moments, disagreements, just a lot more insight into who these guys are as people, beyond what we think of them, as podcast hosts or actors or comedians or musicians. Sean is just, that's one thing too that comes off on the podcast and the show. But like, it's crazy how talented Sean Hayes is. Like,
he's so talented.
He's literally on Broadway right now, like, and his show that they've talked about on the podcast so much. He's just incredibly talented. And I think the show spends a lot of time really delving into their relationships with one another as one-offs, and then kind of how the three of them come together. But the series is great. It's directed by Sam Jones. The majority of the series is in black and white. But it is kind of cool seeing them go across the country. And these guys who are used to being on film sets, or in theatrical runs and things like that, with the grind. But then kind of the three of them coming together with the different ways that they work, or the ways that they thrive, or the ways that they prefer things, which they know about one another. But seeing them have to do that in the same hotel room, night in and night out for this run of tour dates, I think is really kind of fun and funny. And it's just, it's a great add-on if you love the podcast. Even if you don't like it could be a gateway to the podcast.
Right.
It's cool to see it on Max. I really wish I would have went to the DC show. I was like so close to going. Especially I was regretting it once I saw that, it starts off with Will Ferrell as their guest for that show. But they had some amazing people. Like Conan and AOC, Bradley Cooper, just a really cool rundown of people as the special guests for those dates. But it's just I love the behind the curtain stuff, and that's what works so well about that podcast, is like their guests are incredible. Yes. But it's also just like, I love just seeing or hearing and listening to like three friends who individually I really like and appreciate and respect as entertainers, who are also really genuinely like best friends. And it's just really cool to get even more of that insight and that access in the series. And it is kind of bonkers how huge that podcast is. It's kind of took what like Armchair Expert did, and it's doing it on possibly an even larger level than what that show is. But it's a really cool series. I definitely recommend it. All 6 episodes are now available on Max. I think that was, and I think that's what I had listed out for the episode today. Was there anything else you guys wanted to mention? You mentioned the Max
Platonic.
transition.
Have you guys checked out Platonic?
I didn't watch it yet. No, is the embargo up for that?
The first 3 episodes are out.
Okay. No, I haven't.
So maybe I could just talk about those. I mean, this show is like, I love what Apple TV's doing. Apple TV Plus is doing. It's kind of they're going for a prestige thing. And, I don't know if I've ever seen a show that kind of tackled this sweet spot after you turn 35, 36 and over, when you kind of have these relationships with people, especially if you're, you are creative. you kind of leave with people of all shapes and sizes and sexes, and a platonic relationship with somebody of the opposite sex, and how you may need them later on. Like, it's just weird how I've had those relationships where, like, you may not talk to somebody for 5 years, and then one day something comes up, like, you saw somebody from a time where you were a little more outside, and you guys connect again, and there's something really cool about it. I've never seen a show that really captures that, and how they can kind of bring up a side of you that you haven't been able to access for a really long time. And Seth, I'm not gonna say Seth Green. Well, fuck am I saying? Seth Rogen and Rose Byrne are just electric. It's just pretty incredible. And her husband, Luke McFarlane, I don't know what he's doing in it, but he really is kind of absorbing. For every piece of crazy energy that these two have, he's the opposite of that, and he really is doing something in this show. Along with everybody at Seth, Will is the character's name, Seth Rogen's character. This brewery that he runs, his friends, and the connection between everybody, and the history of the friendship kind of unfolds each episode. You figure out a piece and why somebody's there, or what they represent, and their connection to his past and her past. And it's just a really funny show that has a lot of heart. And I don't know how
they have such great chemistry from Neighbors. I remember, like, that's really when she kind of appeared on. I mean, I'd seen her in things before, but that was ever since Neighbors. Yeah. I've really been excited whenever Rose Byrne pops up in something. So her and Seth Rogen doing something again, I feel like that. Yeah, that was the hook. I mean, obviously that is the hook of the show, but I'm saying that's all I needed to know that I want to check it out. So
it's fun, man. Like, it may not have like the most critical acclaim, but it's a fun show. I mean, there's a reason why these guys work. I mean, it's just an energy.
Yeah, and you have the writer director from Neighbors doing this too. Nick Stoller does it.
Right,
so
okay, that makes sense.
Or at least so far of what they've released, he's done, I think, 3 or 4 of the episodes that they've released production credits on. But
it's cool.
Yeah, like, that pairing is just great. And yeah, we've talked about before just how great they are and how funny and underrated Rose Byrne is as a comedic actress. And yeah, she's the best part of any comedy that she's in, really.
Yeah.
But I can't wait to watch this. Yeah, 3 episodes are available now on Apple TV, and sadly, no one's heard of the show.
No one.
I mentioned it to you to try to get us access to it, because of the way we have to get the Apple screeners now, and like no one knew what it was. Like, it randomly came up on like a chart that I was reading, and I'm just like, what? Seth Rogen, Rose Byrne, Nick Stoller, what? 10 episodes? How am I gonna what? And it's like, oh yeah, it's available and you can watch it. It's
half hour or hour, Ronald, episodes?
Between a half an hour and like 40 minutes. Okay. I think they're pretty short. Let me just check so I don't tell you something wrong, because I'm like, it's like right in front of me. Sorry, it's loading. Yeah, half an hour. Half an hour episodes.
I was kind of hoping, for some reason it felt like it should be a half-hour show.
Yeah, 100%.
But I could see them, getting an hour out of it. But for something to feel like a comedy, sometimes briskness is part of the part of the appeal.
Yeah, I can't wait to watch that. And yet again, another show on Apple TV that no one knows about.
Another banger that they just.
Did you guys watch any of Silo, which I mentioned last week?
No, but it's like,
wait to start on that.
Okay,
same.
Yeah,
I cannot wait.
The new episode episode 4 was really good.
I have a friend that just stopped watching it because he's so into it that he wants to
binge it.
He wants to binge it once they all come on. It's like bothering. He's like, it's like Lost. And
it is. It is. It is.
Oh my God, man! Like,
he's not wrong. If you can't wait,
Lost, I'm in there like swimwear. I will be watching it.
Yeah, I mean, it's accurate. I said the same thing last week. It definitely has a Lost vibe for sure.
Cool, man. I'm excited.
All right, John. Anything else you want to mention?
I mean, I saw Attack of the Dock, but I think we're running long. So we
Okay.
can talk about that some other day or never.
All
Yeah,
right.
let's talk about it next week.
Okay. Movie.com is the website. You can find a link there to get to any podcast platform you'd like to subscribe to the podcast on, if you're not already subscribed, which we all hope you are. But Schmovie is also on YouTube, like I mentioned earlier. And you might want to go there and subscribe if this tier list idea sounds interesting to you, because I'm sure Ronald is going to spend the next 7 days figuring out how to make a graphic that is interactive and dynamic for that
Yes.
podcast episode.
And
Absolutely.
Ronald, go ahead and get ready for Halloween. If we do a tier episode for horror films, we can call it Tears for Fears.
There it is. There it is. Cue that up.
Head Over
Ronald.
Heels is one of my favorite songs of all time.
It really gets better every time. Like
It does, man.
For some reason in the 80s, I didn't think about them. But now whenever I hear one of their songs, it's like, holy shit, this is like huge sounding.
Right,
So
right.
good.
That's at youtube.com/movie podcast. If you want to subscribe, hit that bell, because it'll be interesting next week for sure. I can guarantee that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week. And as always, you made our day. Thanks.
Bye.